We'll give them about 2 more minutes to get in, Sarah, and then you'll be ready to go.
And then Jillian, do you speak first or I just go ahead and start?
You'll start in
Okay.
1 minute. Yep.
Let's start. Hello and welcome, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Give me a thumbs up. All right, and welcome to the OSU Access Program September Community Chat. My name is Sarah Dreyer. I am a scholarship, so this program is really a part of me and the community that I exist in. I am currently attending school at OSU. I'm a biology pre-med major. I have about 10 classes left to graduate, so it's just really exciting to have been in the Access program for 2 years now, receiving all of the wonderful information that we get through all of the programming here. I would like to thank you all for joining in this programming and sharing your time with us today. Before we get started, I would like to briefly share just a little bit more about the OSU Access program. So the purpose behind the program is to support single mothers in college, and specifically, it's an academic and a social support program to assist parents as they are going to school and pursuing their education while juggling all the other hats. So the program offers a variety of services to parents that are accepted into the program. And the programming helps with parenting, with your own personal life skills, with child rearing, with academics, handling all aspects of mind, body, and spirit, as well as just survival things, how to get access to resources like housing and other financial resources if needed. Since 2005, our program has organized and offered the national support, the national of bringing together students and community and higher education professionals to discuss the best practices to support parenting when you're also in school. And in May, we successfully hosted a virtual version of the symposium. And so in an effort to continue that and to keep that momentum going with the conversations, this virtual student parent support symposium was created. So we are hosting these monthly Zoom meetings, and they're focused on various topics and discussions that are relevant to you as a parent student. So this is all about you and how to support you and me, and how to make sure we all can achieve success in the goals that we've set for ourselves. It's the hope of the program that with these monthly community chats, that we will be able to bring something that's impactful and thought-provoking in the discussions and conversations. Today, specifically, you're going to hear a conversation, and we hope you participate in the discussion of our presenter, who's an awesome, amazing person here to present so much information that's going to help you and I today as student parents. So with that being said, I would like to introduce our presenter. Today, we have with us Dr. Teresa Anderson, drum roll, and she is a senior research associate at the Urban Institute. She's also an initiative in the Income and Benefits Policy Center, and she's affiliated with the Education, Data, and Policy Center. She leads teams in conducting in-depth mixed method research on important policy issues, primarily evaluations of workforce, education, and social safety net programs and policies. She is particularly interested in improving access to and the success in education throughout the life course from early childhood to adulthood. Her work has focused on student parents, low-income families, opportunities for youth, adult education students, underprivileged college students, high school students from historically underserved populations, and public housing residents. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to present to you Dr. Teresa Anderson. Thank you so much, Doctor, for being here today.
Thank you so much. That was a lovely introduction, Sarah. I appreciate you sharing also a bit about your background, which is just, it's so great that you are so close to finishing, and I'm sure that feels good. Thank you all so much for joining this today. Just to make sure, can you all see my screen? Yes, okay. And you can see the right screen. It's not the presenter view, it's the right one. Okay, good deal. Thank you so much. As Sarah already mentioned, I'm a researcher at the Urban Institute, but I actually did this research as part of my PhD at George Washington University. And I actually graduated this May, almost exactly a year after I became a student parent myself. But this research began before my son was born because of my interest in helping families meet their goals, especially thinking about supports for both generations simultaneously, so like 2-gen approaches. I also heard a lot of stories when evaluating projects in community college and training programs at Urban Institute from students who were motivated to go back to school and succeed because of their children. But the fact that they were parents was rarely acknowledged in their programs in any kind of formal way. And I've also had a long interest in family engagement in children's schooling, so from that angle, so this research kind of brings together a lot of passions and interests. And for me, it's become more personally salient over time. And I'm so glad to find communities like this who are interested in similar issues. So I'm continuing my focus on student parents and family issues in my work at Urban. Jillian said not to shy away from a slightly research-heavy presentation, so bear with me with this, but I'm very happy to answer questions in the discussion period, and hopefully this provides some information that's interesting and valuable to you. So one of the questions I got a lot when I started this project in 2017 is just how common is it for students to have children, and especially for women to go back to school after having children. So IWPR, just giving a shout out that they've done some great work on some of those questions, but I also wanted to share some highlights from my own descriptive data analysis, and I'm glad to go into more detail if folks are interested. But one thing is that being a student mother is common, and I'll talk in a minute about why I'm focusing on student mothers specifically rather than student parents, but this is focused on student mothers. There were over 2.6 million undergraduate student mothers in 2016, which is over a quarter, 28% of all female undergraduate students in the US. Also, thinking about it another way, 34%, so over a third of women with children enroll in school at some point when they have minor children. And 29% of all women with children go back to school after a 2-year gap. This is also an equity issue. So 40% of all Black female undergraduates were mothers in 2016, and over half of Black mothers enroll in school at some point. And similarly, 43% of Black children saw their mother in school at some point while they were minors. Similarly, I didn't have this on the slide, but just that 26% of white mothers and, 26% of white and Latina female students were mothers in 2016. 30% of white mothers, all white mothers enroll in school, and 41% of Latina mothers. But promoting student parent success is promoting the success of students of color in many contexts. And then also there's been a lot of focus on single moms. That is really important. There's a lot of issues, and we'll talk about some of them about single moms. But I also want to point out it's not just single moms. 38% of undergrad student mothers were married in 2016. So when I got into this, I've been thinking a lot about families as systems that kind of influence each other and how children can be an asset that would motivate parents to succeed in education instead of only a challenge. And I feel like sometimes they're only talked about as a challenge in some of the policy discussions that happen. I was originally thinking of focusing in particular on mothers of school-aged kids who are in school themselves, because it's kind of like the kid and the mother are both in school, but I ended up being just a little bit broader. So here are some of the questions that I was looking at. I wanted to know what the short and longer term effects were on academic, economic, and social well-being when mothers return to school for themselves, and then also the effects in the short and long term when they go to school for their children's academic, economic, and social well-being. And then finally, what the experiences are for mothers and their families when mothers enroll in school. And I'll just note that like the outcomes I look at, and I'll show you those, are a little broader than you often see in this work. A lot of research really just looks at employment and education, but I try to look a little bit broader at kind of well-being. So Jillian suggested that you all might be interested in a little brief discussion of methods. I'm glad to go into as much detail as people would like, but I'll start pretty high level. So this was a mixed method study. So that means there was a quantitative and a qualitative component. And those different pieces of information reinforced and informed each other. So the quantitative research was informed by a nationally representative survey of people who were 14 to 22 years old in 1979. That's called the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, called the NLSY for short. So that survey interviewed a national sample of people every 1 to 2 years through 2014, which is the last year of data I used in this analysis. And it also had a child and young adult supplement that actually tracked the biological children of the women who were in the NLSY. And it tracked those children from 1986 to 2014. So that's why I'm looking at student mothers in particular, because I can only track the kids of women. So that's part of the motivation there. So I looked at over 1,100 mothers and over 2,200 children in those surveys. And I'll say that by 2014, the last year of data, the mothers were on average in their early 50s and the children were about 30 years old. So this is kind of a little bit of a longer term look at what happens. So a tricky thing with this sort of analysis is trying to account for what we call selection. It's just the fact that women who went back to school after having kids might be different from mothers who didn't go back to school. You know, maybe they're more education oriented or more organized, or they have other characteristics that affect their own and their children's outcomes. So the nice thing about that survey that I used is that it has a lot of measures of like personality and attitudes and other things from the mother's adolescence that we can try to align between women who went back and those who didn't. So we're not just looking at demographic characteristics, we're looking at a broader range of things about the people themselves. So I use a method called propensity score matching for most of the analyses. It basically takes a whole bunch of characteristics of people in the treatment group, which is those women who went back to school, and identifies comparison mothers who are very similar on that set of characteristics. And without getting too deep in the technical weeds, I'll just say it worked really well. And for some analyses, I was able to use a really slightly stronger model that leveraged data from before the mother school reentry, doing what's called an individual difference in difference model. But honestly, it didn't make a huge difference which model I used. They both worked very well. So I also conducted a set of qualitative interviews. So as I mentioned, this was mixed methods. I talked to 20 student mothers who were enrolled in 2- and 4-year colleges and graduate programs in the National Capital Area in spring 2018. And I did the interviews in fall 2018. And I can talk a little bit more about how I did that recruitment if you're interested, but long story short, I chose 20 mothers who were diverse in age, their race, ethnicity, and whether they were born in the US or not, and then also the level of studies to do those interviews. And this is actually a mix of mothers who returned to school and mothers who continued in school shortly after having a child. So I coded those interview transcripts thematically using a software called NVivo that allowed me to look at patterns and themes in the women's experiences and kind of look at the recommendations that they were citing about how things could be a little bit better for them. I think, and I found that the qualitative analysis really complemented the quantitative by giving kind of a more in-depth set of insights into the kind of the recent context and uncovering some of the nuanced stories about school re-enrollment and the student mother experience. And it really informed and reinforced what I was looking at in the quantitative data as well. And yes, Jessica's highlighting, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to share them in the chat. I have that open, so if there's like clarifying questions or anything, I might be able to address those right away too. So I just want to mention a few caveats before I get into the results and findings. So first, the quantitative analysis is for a specific cohort. So those are women who were in the United States in 1979 and who were born between 1957 and 1964, and then their children. So those women largely went back to school in the late 1980s and early 1990s. So these findings don't reflect some recent changes. You know, we think about more recent immigrant groups or changes in college costs and the labor market in the last few decades. So that's it's a little bit dated, the quantitative. But the advantage is that we get to track over time. So there's always that trade-off. So second, I'll say the methods are pretty strong and they did well statistically, but there always could be some differences remaining between the treatment and the comparison groups in the quantitative analysis that couldn't be fully accounted for. I'll just say, like, this is a caveat researchers always have to say when doing any analysis that's not what's called a randomized control trial. So I don't feel too bad about that one. I think it worked out pretty well. I also am going to talk about some subpopulations of mothers and children in more detail in the findings section. I think those are really important. I think they give a lot of insight into areas to explore in future research, but they're really exploratory because the research was really focused overall on the kind of narrowing in on some subpopulations, but I think it'd be useful to like get a little deeper into some specific focused research. And so finally, I just want to say the qualitative sample is small and it's from a specific time and place. It's not a random sample meant to represent any larger group. So I don't want to generalize too broadly, but there was a lot of consistent themes across those conversations, and those recommendations that came out were really salient, and they do echo things that other researchers in other places and populations have said, but it is a small group. All right, so let's get into some findings from the quantitative analysis. So these are the outcomes. Here we go. I explored for mothers in the quantitative analysis, and I'll have more detail in a sec, but I categorized them into 5 realms, looking at educational attainment, employment, economic security, marriage, and health. And in most of those categories, I have annual measures, which I track kind of year over year to see the trajectory of effects, and then also summary measures to see how things fare in the long term. In educational attainment, I look at high school credential attainment, college degrees, and 4-year college degrees, and then graduate degrees. In employment, I look at employment status and average weekly hours worked. In economic security, I look at both individual earnings and net family income. And then I also look at years married, if the mother had a serious limiting health issue, and her depression rating at age 50. So it's a wide range of outcomes I kind of mentioned earlier. Okay, so getting into some data, some results. So one important thing I want you all to know and keep in mind, and probably won't be a surprise, is that educational growth is gradual. So this graph shows the growth in educational attainment from the treatment group, those women who went back to school, relative to the comparison group for 20 years after the mom first went back to school. And so we see this dark blue line shows high school diplomas, the red line shows college degrees, the green line shows 4-year degrees, which is a subset of college degrees, and then the yellow line shows graduate degrees. And the main takeaway isn't to get into the nitty gritty, but just to see that mothers who went back to school didn't get their credentials and degrees right away. In fact, some women were still getting their degrees 10, 15, 20 years after they first went back. So it's not a one and done experience, and that probably won't be a surprise to those on the call. That said, only about a third of mothers who went back got the next highest credential eventually. So completion is still relatively low if that was their goal, to get the next credential. Okay, so here's a summary of the overall mother findings. So I show results in the short term, which is 0 to 2 years, and longer term, which is more than 2 years in each domain. So just as you're looking at this, you'll see we have the short-term findings in this row here, and we have the long-term findings here in each of these 5 domains I talked about a moment ago. And I color-coded kind of socially desirable findings in green and less desirable ones in red. So things like getting more education is green, having fewer earnings is red, for example. And then I have these pluses and minuses where the number of pluses and minuses indicate the size of the impact as relative to the comparison group. And then those asterisks indicate what we call statistical significance, meaning the effects are statistically different from 0. So basically, if you're quickly glancing at this, you're really looking for things that are green, and as something that's positive, and something that's red is something that's not. So starting with those short-term impacts, mothers did work and earn less right after they went back to school. That wasn't a surprise. That's really common in education and training programs. People are in school, so they're working less. They also had a negative probability of being married in the short term. And in the long term, though, they did attain higher levels of education, as we saw in that other graph. And eventually, they did work and earn more. But net family income was significantly negative because they were less likely to be married over the long term. I'm going to talk more about that in a second. And I'll say also that they didn't have significant physical health problems, but there were at a marginally higher risk of having depression later in life. So I'll get into a few of these details to kind of unpack this a little bit. Okay. So I think it's really useful to kind of look at the trajectory of impacts over time. How do things change in the years after a mom went back to school? So this graph shows average weekly hours worked from the year the mother went back to school, which is year 0, all the way up to 19 years later. And so we can see the solid line shows the impact estimate, and these dashed lines are what we call confidence intervals, which just means that we're 95% sure the real impact is between these 2 dotted lines. But what we can see is that in the year the mom went back and the year after, her average hours worked was negative for the first couple of years, and then it became positive. And actually, over that whole 19-year period, the mothers who went back to school worked an average of 5.7 hours more per week on average, which includes women who didn't work before, it would be 0, as well as women who increased their work effort. So we see there's a positive impact on hours worked and a positive impact on earnings. This is a similar graph where we're looking at earnings in 2014 dollars. And this is tracking people for 14 years after entry. And what we see again is a dip in those earnings initially, but beginning about 4 years after they go back to school, again, this is on average for everyone, mothers who went back began to earn more and became significantly more by about 9 years after reentry. Means we're really confident it was more than 0. So over that entire 14-year period, women who re-enrolled earned an average of about $2,000 more per year. But it took a little while for that to happen, kind of between like 4 and 9 years to see those earnings become positive. And even though the mothers who went back to school earned more themselves, as I kind of mentioned in the overview, actual family economic resources were lower. So by an average about $5,200 per year. And that was pretty consistent over time, you can see in this graph, which might seem strange, but it's because marriage rates were lower for mothers who re-enrolled in school. And that's for complicated reasons. And I'd love to talk about this in the chat. So on average, mothers who went back to school were married for 2 fewer years in the 18 years following re-enrollment. And I will say, though, that going back to school doesn't necessarily cause marriages to dissolve. So I kind of came up with 3 possible explanations, all of which had some support from the qualitative research. So women may return to school during the process of separating or divorcing from their partners. Alternatively, women who are married, their gender roles or other changes in the household may put pressure on relationships and cause them to dissolve. And finally, women who aren't partnered when they go back to school might just be less likely to find a suitable partner if they increase their education later in life, and just might be less likely to get married eventually. And I found support for all 3 of these. I do want to be clear as I'm talking about marriage, I'm not advocating that women stay in bad marriages or saying that people should get married if that's not the right thing for them and their children, but I'm observing that the negative effects on marriage and the loss in family income more than negatively offsets the earning gains that we saw earlier. And that results in fewer resources for the family. And good supportive marriages are generally good things, especially as co-parenting support for children. Okay, so as I mentioned, I did an exploratory analysis on some important subpopulations. I looked at mothers who actually completed a college degree and who didn't have one before they had re-enrolled. That was about, as I mentioned, about 1/3 of the moms got their next degree. I looked at mothers' educational attainment at the point of school reentry, separating those who had less than a 4-year degree before they went back versus those that had a 4-year degree or higher. I looked at women who had a spouse or partner in the household and those who didn't have a spouse or partner in the household as kind of a proxy for being a single mom. Yeah, and Joan mentioned me being able to leave a bad marriage. Let's talk about that in the discussion because I think it's a great point to be talking about. And then I also looked at women's race and ethnicity in the 3 categories that the survey offered, which was non-Hispanic Black, Hispanic or Latina, and non-Hispanic White. So this is like a really quick snapshot of those subgroup results where significant and desirable results are colored green and significant and undesirable results are colored red. And I didn't do all the numbers of pluses and minuses, it's just kind of a quick, green or red. And what you see mostly is that these patterns of results were generally similar across subgroups, so we see like educational attainment positive across everyone, employment effects were positive, and marriage was negative for everyone. But we see some other differences. So completers here, people who actually completed the degree, mothers who had higher educational attainment at baseline, and mothers who had a spouse or partner in the household, so were not single mothers, did not experience negative effects on net family income or health problems. They had a little bit better outcomes in those areas. And mothers who had higher education at baseline and those without a spouse, partner, and Black mothers, though, didn't see earnings gains. So there's a little bit of mixed results in those groups. I'll say, though, that Latina women in this sample saw some of the largest education and income gains along with the completer group. And that actually is true for their children, too, which I'll talk about in a minute. But they had some significantly negative mental health outcomes in the longer term. I got a question about whether any mothers identified as LGBTQ or international. So in this data, I didn't look at, so all of them would be in the US. I didn't look at, I keep wanting to say gender identity, but I didn't look at whether folks were LGBTQ, but I think it was less common, especially in this time period that we're looking at for folks to identify that way. And actually none of my qualitative interviews were folks in same-sex partnerships, but some of them were international or had come from other countries and were doing school here, and I can talk about that in a moment. Okay, so let's look at results real quick for children. So for children, I looked at short-term academic achievement and behavior, and then I looked at long-term academic outcomes, labor market outcomes, and social and well-being measures. So specifically, I looked at, in the short term, standardized measures of vocabulary, math, and reading. I also looked at behavior problems as reported through a parent behavior problems index, a parent reported behavior problems index, and also if the child was ever suspended from school. Longer term, I saw if the child ever received a high school credential, enrolled in college, or ever received a college degree or a graduate degree. I also looked at the child's earnings ever and after they turned 25, their hours usually worked after they turned 25, and the job satisfaction for those who were employed after 25. And as I mentioned, the average age of children was in 2014 was 30, so this is kind of insights into their early careers. And then finally, I saw if they ever got married, were ever convicted of a crime, and ever had serious health issues, and their average depression ratings. So I will say, summing it up, there were some short-term benefits of their mothers re-enrolling in school in vocabulary and reading scores. And you'll recognize this table from what we looked at earlier. We see the short-term here and the long-term, and then each of these realms. And we see some positive effects of vocabulary and reading in the short term. But there were some more reported behavior problems in the short term. And then in the long term, those whose mothers returned to school were more likely to earn a high school credential, more likely to enroll in college, and more likely to earn a college degree. And they had higher job satisfaction. But the reported behavior problems persisted for the 6 years that I was able to track that outcome. And we didn't see significant impacts on earnings, marriage, or depression, but they did have some higher probability of health problems in the long run, which is something we want to think about. So I just wanted to note that it's really interesting that behavioral issues persisted, but also interesting that even though the mothers were much less likely to be married, that didn't seem to translate into significant effects on their kids' marriage probability. So here are some of the subgroups I looked at for kids. I looked at children of mothers who completed college and children of mothers who had different levels of educational attainment when they went back to school. I looked at children by their age at mother's reentry, and I will just say I was particularly interested in seeing if kids in that 6 to 10 age range would be particularly affected in a positive way, just because I was thinking about that role modeling in elementary and middle school that might be happening between kids and parents. And then also I looked at male and female children separately, and I looked at children by their mother's race and ethnicity, which the children's demographics are associated with their mothers, so that's how it's categorized. Okay, so this is a little bit bigger table because there are more subgroups, but it's the same idea of what we just saw. And generally, we can say that patterns were relatively consistent. So we see educational attainment was positive for high school completion, college enrollment, and college degree for most groups, although the older children who were 11 to 17 when their moms went back, basically didn't see any positive benefits. Maybe that's not a surprise because teenagers are more influenced by their peers than their parents, or they were just too old to benefit, but we just saw less for those older kids. We did see that children whose mothers had lower levels of education at reentry, older children, and interestingly females, had somewhat higher or had higher probabilities of being convicted of a crime in the longer term, which to me, even though there's a lot of so many problems with the criminal justice system, might be a signal of some of those behavioral issues we saw persisting for some groups. But we did also see on the positive side earnings gains for mothers children whose mothers actually completed college and children of Latina mothers. And I kind of mentioned earlier that the Latina mothers and their children saw some of the largest positive impacts on college enrollment and completion. And then there was no negative health effects for just some groups here. But I didn't see those big effects I was looking for in that 6 to 10 age range that I was kind of curious about. And Jessica's pointing out that I'll be done very shortly and we'll start getting into the chat. But I wanted to share some stories and recommendations that came from the qualitative interviews, and we can kind of dovetail into the chat. So the qualitative data provided some really rich detail about the perspectives and experiences of mothers who are pursuing education, and I have a lot of findings from this portion of the research, but I'm just going to summarize really quickly some that most closely related to the quantitative findings I just talked about. So first is just that many women made explicit decisions to decrease their work effort and earnings to accommodate schooling and retain some time with their children, and they consider that part of the cost of education, and they anticipated it would pay off financially in the longer term. Sometimes women decided to return to school shortly after their marriage or relationship failed, but sometimes the stress and pressure of schooling or their new self-identities challenged continued partnerships. I would say, again, it would not be accurate to say that school re-enrollment causes marriage rates to decline, but there is kind of an understandable association. Women experience mental health challenges and immense stress while in school, and their support networks were often informal through family and partners and friends. Some women discuss positive role modeling and what we call concerted cultivation of children, which might point toward better child outcomes. But the qualitative findings don't really explain well why children had those negative behavioral issues that we saw in the quant data. And because I only talked with mothers, but not with the children themselves, it's a little difficult to figure out what might be driving that result. So that might be something worth following up on. I have some theories I can talk about in the chat if you're interested. And then just saying that given the positive themes about child development in the qualitative work and the positive effects on education outcomes in the quantitative analysis, I guess I was a little surprised I didn't see more positive impacts on children's longer term employment and earnings. That said, it's possible those effects just hadn't manifested yet in the time I was looking at. And it's also possible that there's kind of a stickiness in intergenerational mobility, and it just takes more to overcome that than a parent's additional education later in life. So that's another area where it really would be worth researching a little more, and maybe doing interviews with people who were children when their parents went back to get their reflections. So this is just a quick summary of some of the most common recommendations for interventions that would help women succeed from the qualitative interviews. And of course, this won't be a surprise. Topping our list is on-campus babysitting or childcare, followed by faculty and staff sensitivity training and a resource center or support group for student parents or student mothers more specifically. And I'm going to just like show you these, but we can talk about them more if you're interested in the Q&A, because I want to make sure you all have time to chat. But I kind of developed these kind of realms or kind of wheels of policy issues, thinking about developing a safe and welcoming campus culture, creating advising supports, creating better financial support, childcare, and social supports. And I can talk through any of these if you want, and different ways that we can probably leverage policy to improve outcomes for these families. This was all pre-COVID that I was doing this work, so things have changed a little bit, but I think the issues persist. Other quick recommendations for longer-term success: helping student parents choose programs that may lead to better job outcomes based on labor market demand, based on connections to employment, and based on jobs that actually are like friendly to parents, because I think that's an important consideration. Also improving completion, because we saw the results were much better for parents who completed and for their kids. So thinking about thoughtful pedagogy and practices, better support and accelerated strategies, supporting parents' socio-emotional needs, which might also include marital counseling or general mental health support. Helping parents enter the college door and thinking about outreach and recruitment strategies that are inclusive and welcoming of student parents, and also addressing child needs while parents are enrolled. And more research is needed on how to do that, but it does seem like there's an opportunity there. So overall, quick summary: mothers who re-enrolled got more education, they worked more and they earned more on average, but they were less likely to be married, and family income declined, and there were some long-term negative mental health effects. Children of mothers who re-enrolled did do better academically in the short and the long term on average, but that didn't always translate into earnings gains in the time that I observed them. And they did experience more behavioral problems that seemed to persist for some groups. And then enrollment was just hard on families, but mothers think it was worthwhile to meet their employment and personal goals and to set a good example for their kids. But they did express that they could use more support. So with that, thank you so much. I'm glad to have the Q&A in the chat. And I do see that there's a question in the chat about any specific health limitations for children, and I couldn't get into that level of detail in this analysis, but I do think that's a good question that definitely is hanging out there that would be worth looking into a little bit more. And if any of you have insights, that would be really great. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Hello, everybody. I'm Jillian Deese, and I'm typically always here, but I never actually introduced myself. So I'm Jillian Deese. I work as the GAA for Access Collaborative and am a parenting student as well. I'm working on a master's in educational policy. So Dr. Anderson, I think a lot of our folks were really happy with all the research stuff that you presented, because you gave a lot of clear methods and things that, you know, they can actually understand, like this is how this research came about, to move a lot of things forward, because that was an older research study that you used, the qualitative information. So I'm sure that's been used in other places as well. And it's probably informed a lot of policy changes that we might not be aware of.
Yeah,
So,
I don't actually think that many people have really looked at these issues in this way before. So there's been a little bit of research like focusing on kids when their moms get more education, but it's very narrow and it's often just like one point in time, okay, the most recent data, what do we see from that? But not so much looking at like the trajectory over time, looking at how they interact like among the parents and kids. So I'm hoping that this can inform some more policy discussions. I think it matters.
really always moving it forward a little bit, just a little bit, we'll get there, the incremental version. So a few of the questions that have come up so far while you were discussing is Joan asked, and I think this might have been about slide 15 specifically, what about more able to leave a bad marriage? So I think she was referencing when you were talking about marriages, because I definitely have never heard a statistic around that, which is amazing to hear. And maybe you can understand that question to elaborate some more for us.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. So I'm going to base this more on the qualitative because definitely heard a lot of people talking about their relationships and marriages and heard about, so for example, one of the older women who I spoke with who was going back to school, she'd actually come up from another country where she was a medical doctor. And then she came to the US because of her, and she'd actually gone back to school in her home country 10 years after getting her undergrad degree to become a doctor. And her husband was kind of like sort of supportive, but then really resented it. And she eventually became a doctor and practiced in her country. But like her husband's like, she basically kind of found herself and ended up leaving him because he wasn't really there for her when she needed his support. And eventually came to the US and then went back in school here to try to get her credentials so she could practice medical in the medical field here. But she definitely talked about how that was something that played in for her. There was another woman who was kind of a similar situation who had come back for the second time, and the first time she went back, her husband was like not super supportive, and that was something. And then there was one, and again, this is kind of individual stories, but there was one woman who I think spent like over half the interview really struggling with the fact, she's like, my husband kind of supports me, and he's like, he's the force behind me, but also he's not. He's really trying to put me in a box. And she, anyway, was pregnant with twins and already had 2 kids and was trying to negotiate. Her husband was from another country. They were from a country in Africa, and was a very kind of patriarchal understanding of how dynamics should be. And she was kind of finding herself and feeling like trying to negotiate that relationship. And I don't know where it ended up, but it might have.
And I'm sure part of the financial gains that they do get kind of offsets the ability to then leave the marriage and try to reclaim that independence, even though you showed it doesn't necessarily mean they're, gaining wealth, but they're at least able to do it and still support what they need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And multiple women who said that their marriages were kind of ending anyway, and they realized they needed to be able to earn more and support their kids and kind of be on their own. And so that's why they went back. So I think there's a lot of different things going on there.
It's so interesting because I've heard in different sessions about parenting students that there are discrepancies even among advisors in college when they're advising the father versus the mother. And so I can only imagine being married with someone who's not supportive, and then your advisor is also like, yeah, you could just get your bachelor's and just stay at home with the kids. Your husband can get the master's, it'll be great. So that's a really interesting qualitative piece to add to that.
I will say that every person I talked to who was married or had a serious partner had some dynamics around them being in school, whether it was trying to trade off childcare responsibilities or whether it was trying to being like, I need space to study. It just puts pressure on those relationships because it's another thing you're doing and it's a lot and it's heavy and you're dealing with, raising a family too. And so I think it's just, some people can navigate it together and some, it just works out better to not, so.
Yeah, and Marianne just chimed in on the chat too, and she said, I don't think many people realize there are a lot of moms who became single because their spouse didn't support their educational and career pursuits. And maybe that also comes from the liberation of education that lets us really rediscover ourselves sometimes and understand the agency we have as women. And I'm sure this might, extend into LGBTQ relationships as well. That dynamic of, you don't have to be stuck in one place or things like that. And I think that I would wonder how that correlates maybe with older student parents who go back, as compared to maybe the younger ones. Because I wonder if the older ones, some of that age of wisdom teaches that too.
I think age of wisdom teaches us all kinds of things about navigating relationships and juggling things. So yeah, I definitely heard some like thoughtful reflections from some of the older women who I spoke with. Because as I said, I tried to talk to people who were different age groups, and some of them were going back, in their 50s, or even there was one woman who was a grandmother who was raising her grandchild, and I talked to her about it. So.
Okay, so we got some more questions and comments coming in. See, I had one also tucked away. So someone also asked earlier, and you might not speak to this, but I know we have some people on the call who could answer this question. They asked how they could go about finding free or low-cost resources, grants to boost their ability to help parenting students. I'm not sure what you're aware of, but you can share what you know, and then if anybody wants to chime in and open their audio up, you're welcome to.
Yeah, I've been talking a lot, so I'm glad for other people to like kick up the chat and share ideas, and I can jump in as needed.
Yeah, I agree. I would like to hear more voices than what we plan. So you guys should be able to unmute yourself if anybody wants to chime in. I know Stacy Hartley's here from Bowling Green State, and they're starting a new program, so I'm sure they probably are wondering these kind of questions too.
But we had that kind of the flip side. We had a donor come forward as we're building it and gave us $30,000 and wants us to get to the community foundations to get this program out in front of them to see how they can support it.
Thanks, Stacy. Yeah, I do remember that now because you guys have been trying to figure out how to build it. You're like, okay, we have it. Spend the money, figure it out, which is a good problem to have. And honestly, I think some of that might happen more going forward because with all the other things going on in the world, I think there's actually a bigger spotlight on parenting students because professors are seeing their parenting students more in class with their kids, as well as professors are having to teach with their kids. So I think there's a different level of visibility happening, right, as implicated in virtual education. So let's go back to this question that Marianne opened. She asked if you could talk more about the difference between moms who earned an associate's versus a bachelor's degree, specifically for kids' outcome.
That's a great question. So let me just think real quick about that. So when I was looking at the groups for kids, I didn't break it down to that level of detail because you get into like smaller sample size problems. So a lot of my work at Urban is in like community college and training programs, and I think there's a lot of potential value in associate's degrees that, like, it's not, bachelor's degrees aren't always the way to go. So I didn't break it down that way, but I could, and if you're really interested, I'm happy to like try to run some stuff and follow up. But that wasn't something I looked at in detail there.
In a future research study, it probably could circle around back to that and maybe look at the actual programs as opposed to the degree length, since an associate's degree in IT right now is a pretty good field to be in, and pretty financially, wealthy right now, as opposed to maybe a teaching degree that I have that it does what it needs to do, but it doesn't put you, in the upper pay scale as much as some degrees would.
And there were some folks, I would say, in the qualitative who like had a higher degree and then went back to school for an associate's degree because they want to change fields or because their degree was from another country and so it wasn't valid here. It wasn't always kind of a straight line from associate's to bachelor's, whatever.
Right. Let's see. There's lots of commentary in the chat too. I love it. Um, so here's a question that has come up, and again, Teresa, you can chime in. Anybody who wants to pop on, unmute themselves, feel free. Do you have advice for how to help moms combat the guilt they may feel from going to school while having little ones?
I'm gonna let other people take a first pass at that. I definitely am a mom who, I'm not in school anymore, although I was the first year of my son's life, but even a working mom, I feel like I'd be glad to hear.
I can speak to it a little bit because I think I've mitigated most of it away. I still have mom guilt sometimes because I take my son to school with preschool now, and then I come back home and work from home. And theoretically, he could stay home. But I recognize how productive I am not when he is around, how easily distracted I am with all the mom duties. And I also noticed that he has more fun at school because he gets to play with his friends. They eat food that he might like more than I push a lot of healthy food into him. So sometimes he's not happy with me on the food side. He gets to have more experiences than I could necessarily provide him with in a time of our day. So to mitigate the guilt away, I just kind of look at our priorities and what we're all working towards, and check the goals, because I've always had evening classes since I've had him, and that was the hardest part. Like, we should be home, and I'm not, and we're gonna get home late, go straight to sleep. So that's what I think. Is there anybody else who wants to chime in on that? Sarah, I don't know if you're still with us. Maybe you could chime in how you deal with mom guilt.
So I don't want to get people on face to chime in if you want, but I will say that a lot of the women I talked to were really motivated by the fact that like they were going to get their degree eventually, and that was going to be a really important like role modeling moment, and also that was going to allow them to move ahead in their careers and just like in their own kind of self identity. That was going to benefit their kids. Like that was like, it's like mind to the goal. There was one woman who I interviewed who had moved to another state and had to leave her two kids because she was doing a pharmacy program, and she was going from she transferred from a 2-year to a 4-year college, and she wasn't going to drive her kids all the way, halfway across the country if it wasn't going to work, and while she's still figuring it out. So she left them with a cousin for like the first year of the program. And, she was just trying to be like, look, this is for them. I have 2 years in this program, and like, I hope I can bring them here with me, but no matter what, it's going to like be worth it in the end because I'm going to have this great career. So.
And I think that's actually a lot more common than sometimes we imagine, that, the kids would be left with a family member or friend while and so I wonder that, that to me, I would imagine that takes a hard toll on the mom. But in reality, it probably makes everything a little easier because you can stay focused and do the best you can, and your kids are safe and well taken care of in the meantime. Especially if it means traveling. It's cheaper to get 1-bedroom apartment anyway. So Denise also shared that she tells her students and herself that if you are working and or going to school, you are modeling strength for your children, communicating with them about the importance of going to work and school, as well as dedicating minutes a day with your children. Just engaging in fun is really helpful to foster that emotional connection and try to mitigate that guilt. And I agree. Having some time aside during the day that you guys engage in that space, just have fun with each other, is nice. At this point, I let son on my lap during classes. He made funny faces on the camera. I don't know. He enjoyed it. Like, he's mad, dude. Like, mommy, I like being at school with you. I'm like, it's working for now. That's why I'm like, we can still go back in person. But it's working. There was a question, and I know this was, your work was done pre-COVID, but maybe speak to some of the other, global instances that were happening during the study focused on. They asked how, any recommendations to better serving during COVID-19, but I think we can generalize that to just during turbulent times in society, maybe more so about economics than anything else.
So, sorry, Julian, your audio is cutting out just a tiny bit. What was that last thing you just said?
Okay, I thought it might have been. They asked if you just had any recommendations based on the finding of your study, any recommendations for better serving students during COVID, or we could just say during turbulent economic and societal times, to be more general.
Yeah, that's definitely something everyone's talking about right now. I think all of the issues around childcare, around advising, around emotional support, all these things are just like extra super focused during COVID, and also much more difficult to deliver. So I think it's kind of like the issues are the same, but the ways of dealing with them and the need for them are like much harder. So, I mean, I actually think this is the group to open that question up to. It's something that I know that this group has been talking about, since COVID started. So I've let other people kind of take a pass at that too.
Okay, I think so it'll just be us. Okay. Let's keep on with these questions. There's two more I'll cover before we wrap up. And one of them came from
What about health limitations?
No, you answered that already. So that's why I'm like, that's an old question. It actually supposed to be one from Joan, and it says, do you have any guesses about what kinds of things might be different for children of mothers who have gone to school much more recently?
Yeah, I think there's definitely been some things that have changed, and that, even just looking at the quantitative and the qualitative, which were like, decades apart. So when we're looking back at the late 80s, early 90s, the whole welfare and AFBC system, like there was no TANF yet. It was like there was more cash support available for women and kids, and the system was a little bit simpler. Not that it was perfect, but it was just a little more available and a little bit simpler. So I think that was one thing. I think the cost of education has gone up a lot, and student debt has gone up a lot, and like the nature of financing has changed in this time. So I think people are taking on a lot more debt, and that might be making them think even more about, which programs to go into, which ones are going to pay off. I mean, the labor market has changed quite a bit. Women are participating much more in the labor market now than they used to. So there's also that kind of, so I'm all about women's labor force participation. I think that's can be a double-edged sword, because there's this expectation that like, I need a job, and I need a full-time job, and I need a job that's going to support my family, and like there's just less fallback, there's fewer supports, and there's more expectation that you're going to kind of like do it all, even if you're a single mom. And then I just think there's less childcare. Like there used to be more on-campus childcare. There used to be more employer-provided childcare. I feel like it used to be easier to get, and now it's harder. It's more expensive, and it's more complicated in many cases, unless you can pay private rates, which are really high. So I just think, yeah.
I almost speculate to imagine that families typically lived closer back at that point in time too, so you had more family support nearby to help offset some of that childcare, as opposed to now people are a lot more likely to be spread out, or just lack a lot of support, family support rather.
Yeah, I agree.
So last question is a hardy one, it looks like. Are there any details regarding the behavioral issues of children, regardless of the age groups? If so, what do those behaviors look like? Were they already present before mom went back to school, etc.?
So I could dig into that a little bit more. I didn't look at that like all disaggregated. I do have a little bit on that, but I don't know off the top of my head, but I can look at the types of behaviors. I will say though that the statistical model controlled for any behavioral issues before the mom went back. So at least when I was doing that comparison, it was like even-handed. These kids looked really similar on behavior and kind of everything else before the mom went back, and then sort of seeing what happened after. So that part you know, I feel pretty confident about, but in terms of what they exactly were, I'd have to double check and circle back, but I'm happy to do that.
I appreciate that. That was a good question because I do wonder what those behaviors look like. I would assume it'd be a lot more acting out, maybe looking for more attention out of mom and things like that. Attention seeking behaviors, but because I wouldn't imagine that, you know, mom going to school would cause the kid to develop any focus, you know, disorders and things like that. So it's a good question and a good thing to wonder about. Yeah. Well, Teresa, we are going to wrap up because we are at our hour point, and I have to pull my PowerPoint back up for us.
While you're doing that, I just want to say thank you all so much for the questions. Thank you for giving me the space. Thank you for being a great audience. And I'm really happy to follow up with any things that you want. As I said, this was super research forward, but I'm also thinking a lot about policy and policy solutions. I'm happy to talk about that. So.
All right, let me deal with my technical difficulties today. All right, and okay, there we are. Here's your contact information, Dr. Anderson. There's her website for urban.org. The bit.ly there is a link if you're interested in reading it. She said it's very long, but she's more than welcome to indulge in that. And we also dropped these links in the chat for those who want to quickly grab them. I want to share one more thing, and that is next time we'll be here in October. Everybody will be getting ready for any fall festivities they're going to start having. I will have maybe a Halloween background. I'll try to make sure. And for our next session, we'll have on October 29th. It's a Thursday. Time hasn't been established yet. Registration is open. There's a bit.ly there if you can type that or grab it. If not, we'll send emails and it'll be there. Lastly, if you'd like to lead a discussion, submit a proposal. It's a really simple proposal, much more simpler than our symposium proposals. Just come chat with us and let's up topics that apply to parenting students and broaden the content that we've already created so far. Thank you, everybody. See you in October. Bye, Dr. Anderson. Thank you.